Hello. I imagine that most of you have been here for other events at the festival, but if not, let me give you the official welcome that I have in front of me. Welcome to the Working Class Writers Festival, a new festival celebrating and showcasing working class writers from across the UK. And you must know by now that you can follow us on @ClassFestival. Bit of business first of all. I'm really sorry to say that both Pragya Agarwal and Stella Duffy are too unwell to be with us today, which is a real shame. However, I'm more than delighted to look down the line and see that we have with us Melissa Chemam, Craig Johnston, and Dr. Vanda Wyporska. Did I get that right?
Wyporska. You've just made
Wyporska. Sorry. I was so proud of it. And then I got it. Vanda Wyporska. And my name's Cole Moreton. And what we're going to be doing over the next little while is reflecting on a series of questions, really. We've all, or most of us, have been in really quite inspiring sessions this weekend, talking about access, talking about social mobility, talking about how you can break through the barriers that are there. And I think what we wanted to do as we come to the end of this amazing festival, frankly, was to think, well, actually, all this talk, all these words, all this writing, can they actually make a difference? Can we actually change the world? Can we actually make things better? What difference can stories make to real lives? How has that worked in our experience? What is it that we're trying to change? And what have we got to offer as working class writers or writers from a working class background that's unique or useful? And another question is, who are we doing this for? Are we doing this for ourselves? Are we doing this for the next generation? Are we doing it for people who need to understand a broader experience of life? Who are we doing it for? So I couldn't really think of better people than the people on this panel to explore that with, but also you as well. So what we'll do is we'll talk for a bit about who we are and where we come from and why we're here and how the things that we're involved in might engage with some of those questions. And then we'll have a more general discussion pursuing some of that, and then we'll very much want to hear from you and hear your contribution and your questions. So is that okay? Yeah? Okay, general nods of approval, that's good. One or two suspicious looks. And some thinking, this isn't the seminar I was coming to. But that's tough, we're here. You're welcome to leave at any point. So, Melissa, why don't we start with you, since you're at the far end there. Tell us who you are and what you do and what you're doing here.
Right. So I'm a journalist, mostly. I've been a journalist for 15 years, and now I teach at UWE, the University of the West of England, in media production and journalism. I'm a writer. I've been a radio journalist for years. I moved to the UK 12 years ago to join the BBC World Service, and then I worked from London and from Nairobi, but I'm originally from Paris, where I grew up. My parents themselves moved from Algeria to Paris, so I'm sort of like every generation migrant. And I came to Bristol about 7 years ago to write a book about the music scene, and especially about the band Massive Attack and the way they address social issues. And pretty much all the artists I interviewed were working class, so it was kind of looking at how they were trying to make the world look more like themselves in some ways, and to address certain issues through music and video and so on.
Given your background and the various, as you said, the transitions that happened in your background, is working class a phrase, a title that you identify with?
Well, it's an interesting question. I thought about that when I was talking about the festival with Natasha. Obviously, the situation is very different in France. We have a very long tradition of socialism, and I grew up in a communist town. I mean, a town that was run by a communist mayor, and we had symbols of communism in the classroom. So it's something that's really banal. I lived in a very left-wing industrial suburb. But obviously, there's in France a much different sense of social mobility and the way we relate to culture. I do find that in the UK, and more since I've been here, culture is very much associated in a way with certain classes, and if you can't really use a different class culture without betraying your roots. And in French, we say from someone who changed class that he's a transfuge, which means that he basically moved from a place to another, while in English you say de facto, I think you do. So it means like you're a traitor, right? So I've had these issues all my life because it's hard to identify where I come from for a lot of people. So when I moved from my suburb to Paris to study, went to a very prestigious university, there was no one like me. So no one would assume I was like an immigrant or a working class child, parents who were earning below. And I was a granted student simply because there was none of them there. It was a very elitist place. So people just put labels on who you are. But then because of that, I've kept this very strong identity. So in France, people would say, not that they're working class, because obviously we associate that with work of the past, the industrial era, and now with jobs moving into services and low-paid zero-hour contract, it's not exactly the same sort of work. So people would just maybe call themselves underprivileged or lower classes, but the notion of work is approached differently. So when I came to Bristol and the debate was quite vivid a few years ago, and especially with Brexit, I felt like a lot of people would use working class and they were not really working class. But, again, it's not only about how people define you, self-identification is very important. I've worked myself a lot on identity issues and, religious background because I've lived in East Africa. My family's from North Africa. So obviously this is also one of the other problems that we have, that if you identify with a different religion in France, you can be completely ostracized, much more than if you're very poor. So it goes into this authenticity and self-identification as well. And I've heard many, many times over in my life, well, if you can pass as something else, you should do it. And for me, it's just, I just can't do that, It's just where you're from. And as we were saying just before, the way you sound will be how people will identify you. And because I moved to London to work for the World Service, you have to sound like, this sort of like non-existing English person. I'm still trying. I still sound weird, apparently, a bit different influences. But then I don't sound working class in English. And I don't really know what I sound like in France. People told me, oh, you sound like Arte, the French-German cultural channel, because I have a very soft female voice. So I was told all my life, oh, you can't do radio or TV. You're not, you drink a lot of whiskey, and then you'll be serious, but you're not a serious journalist voice. So it's all about this sort of mislabeling and authenticity, and how to reclaim what you come from the lowest part of society, where you don't take the cliche that people want to put on your head. So I'm sure a lot of other people have got this experience. But when you're a writer on top, obviously people associate writing with a certain part of the upper class. We've talked a lot here about the middle class, but in France it's definitely the upper middle class. Especially if you're a foreigner, it's like, the only very rare non-French, as I call them, to avoid the word white, because obviously doesn't mean much, that are famous or that are well-read or sell a lot of books. They're from very, very privileged family, like, the first 10 wealthiest family in Morocco or in Brazil. So that's a very closed world, much more than here, actually. But anyway, it's not a definite answer, but it opens
No, it's great.
route for comparison, I guess.
There's lots to unpack there. Craig, how about you?
There was lots of talk in the last session about imposter syndrome, and I very much, because I'm a doctor as well, I never put that on a biography because I don't identify with doctor, because I don't know what that means, and I'm always scared on a plane as well if somebody comes and says, "Oh, you're the doctor," but also a writer.
What are you a doctor of?
Philosophy, so a PhD.
Right, so they might need a doctor of philosophy, like if the plane is going down and they want to think about what's going to happen.
Very useful.
If you have an existential crisis, then I'm the person. But so that label, but also a writer. I just say I've never met any writers apart from recently. I don't know what a writer looks like. I'm always interested in the writer's background. In terms of my background, my father was a weaver. I come from a small town. Forfar next Dundee, which is famous for jute, jam, and whatever else. There is no jute anymore. It's polypropylene, which is a basis of oil. My mother was a cleaner. She worked 5 jobs, one to try and get me through university, which was interesting. in itself. But I never, going back to what Melissa was saying, I never felt working class until I got a job in academia. And I've worked in various professions, psychology, as a counsellor, youth work, social work for 25 years. And it's only when I started in higher education that suddenly I wasn't working class anymore. I was told that. I've had colleagues debate my class in front of me about how many baths I took. Apparently I passed.
How many baths you took? On what?
Well, again, this is the thing, I never thought anything of it, but you just had a bath on a Sunday night with your brother, you know, and you just hoped he wasn't the youngest because you left the ring on the bath.
Exactly,
you know. And then it got me thinking about where did the bath come from, because we didn't have central heating, we just had fireplaces. Was that kettles? You know, and it's, I had to go and ask my dad. But yeah, so it was only when I got to higher education, but school, again, those boundaries, school was never a place, it was a place to get through. It wasn't a place to enjoy other than with your mates. And I got told at 15 that I wasn't going to pass anything, so just leave. So I was told to go and be a window fitter or something like that, which is great. I'd probably be making great money now. But you know, I never felt like academia was a place for me. So I'd spent 25 years, and luckily, and I like this idea of luck in working class academics' lives about, you know, you're supported in the right way, you met the right people. But I was a football player. So that was my kind of, and I don't like the narrative of escaping, but that was it. So it gave me an insight into a different world. And people just want to talk about football. But I'm not the Craig Johnston that played for Liverpool with the hair or an Australian accent. Much to disappointment. People on Twitter have invited me.
Invented the Predator boot, which has made him a millionaire. But anyway, that's not you.
But people have invited me. But yeah, so from that experience, I started to do some articles on the power of being working class in academia, but more about teaching and learning, the influence that can have on students. And so I had a look around the literature, and I couldn't find anything at all about, you know, being working class and actually that being a really good thing in academia, in a classroom. So I wrote to the Times Higher Education, and by luck, there was 5 other people who had wrote an article, so being working class in the academy. It wasn't our title, but and through that, we all met each other, and we started the Alliance of Working Class Academics, and we do a lot of things like putting on support sessions for PhD students who are from working class heritage or background, Carl Binns, Geraldine Van Buren. So we just meet and we talk, and we put on different seminars and sessions just for people. And it's amazing the lack of, and again, some people would say it's ignorance, but when I got my PhD, I thought that was the end of my journey. I thought, because I remember telling my mum, I'm going to be a doctor, Mum. And my mum thought, oh, you know, that's it. The whole family needs to retire now. But actually, I'm more precarious now in academia than I think I was when I was working for local authorities. But yeah, so we put on that, and what we're trying to do is just reconcile sort of the collective spirit of our backgrounds and try to develop knowledge from us, even though that we don't really know what sort of middle-class cultural capital is, and to navigate the systems. And it is about money, it is about resources, it is about, if you're off for 6 months, how are you going to navigate that? It is about having time to write and the space to write, as Alberto mentioned in the previous session. But very much feel like an imposter here. Much better if I'm talking to me in the pub, then I can have a bit. I don't consider myself to write, I struggle to write. So most of my research is through the voices of young people on the margins of society, because I have an access, I'm a gatekeeper to that world, so I just want to share their stories and their voices, because I think that needs to be heard, because a lot of them, it's interesting, my background is probably a carbon copy of hundreds of thousands of other kids who wanted to play football, kind of made it in football, but didn't really, and ended up staying where they are for the rest of their lives. So to me, I'm just a carbon copy, and I've kind of navigated my way out of it by luck, maybe by some skill, but I consider writers to be more skillful than football players. I've met loads and loads of famous football players, and I get signatures from people, writers. I never ever got a signature from football players, because I just thought you just turn up, you do 3 or 4 hours in the training ground, and if your coach likes you, then you've got a career. But for me, writers are just brilliant. You know, they're just great. I think they walk around with huge heads. You know, but like Stephen Ball when I met him. But yeah, I just think that I'm using this platform to raise the voice of hundreds of thousands of kids just like me, who are more than capable getting into spaces like this.
I think there's a lot to pick up there. Thank you. And affirmation for any writers in the room. You're fantastic. But then, so I think the same can be said of academics in your position. Vanda, let's talk about you for a minute.
Yeah, so I think a lot in common with colleagues here, and I suppose the thing is that, you know, to some extent, being black, it's almost conflated with being working class, and there've been many times I was talking on the Moral Maze on Radio 4 about access to elite universities, and the number of times they conflated black or disadvantaged with black and disadvantaged was really quite scandalous. So to some extent, it doesn't feel so different because it's always been something that's been assumed about me that I am working class. I mean, very different to the situation in the States where you see a much bigger black and Asian working class than you do in the UK. And I suppose, you know, in terms of writing, as soon as I knew what a book was, I wanted to write one. It was always my ambition from being a really small child. And some of my best memories were my mum taking me to Chester Library, which was this magnificent, magnificent building at the time. It's since changed. And realising that all of these books were here and I could just choose them and take them home, and 5 or 6 at a time. And it was just miraculous. And I was a really, really voracious reader. I was an only child for 20 years, so that probably helped. I didn't really have much to do back in the day when, you know, we still had 4 channels and didn't really watch much TV. But the way that I realised pretty quickly that I was going to be able to write a book was through doing a doctorate, because that was a kind of almost a pathway to do that. And I loved academia. But I'd always been writing, and I'd written as a journalist. And I remember when I was finishing off my first degree, my Polish tutor, because my degree was in Polish, I had dinner with my Polish tutor and his wife, and she was a journalist. And I said, look, I don't know what to do. I love journalism, I want to be a journalist, but I really want to be an academic and I want to write. And so I suppose writing's been the theme of my life, whether it's been journalism, whether it's been being a press officer, whether it's been academic writing. And in fact, you know, I got told off in the first year of my master's for writing in too journalistic a style. So I've always had to adapt my style. So I really took the opportunity of doing a DPhil to write a book. And so, you know, my doctorate was published. There were various issues along the way with various gatekeepers. And it was the proudest moment of my life when I, you know, saw my book come back with my name on it. And I thought, that's it, you know? That was my big dream. I've done that. Anything else in life is going to be a bonus. But it's not the same type of writer as being a fiction writer or being someone who is widely read. You know, there's a print run of 400 copies, and if you want to buy my book, it's about £85. So understandably, there are many people who are interested in early modern Polish witchcraft between 1500 and 1800. And I can promise you it's a rollicking read of working class history. You know, there weren't many posh witches in the early modern period. But, you know, it's not a big seller. But it was my dream, and it's actually allowed me to be an academic beyond academia. And that was an article I wrote for The Guardian many years ago when I realised that what I liked about academia was, and I'm sorry, you're going to really hate me for this, but what I loved about what I thought about being an academic was the lecturing, the sharing the ideas with students, the long holidays, the going to conferences. What I didn't really want to do was the marking and the exams and all of those sorts of things. Or I didn't want the precariousness that, you know, I could see even in the 90s, talking to my tutors, you know, we were heading towards a precarious situation. So in a sense, being an academic without that kind of baggage of academia has been really interesting because it's allowed me to still talk about my research, you know, do events and that sort of thing. But I think coming back to your point, I was, up until September, the executive director of the Equality Trust, which was a national charity that campaigns to reduce social and economic inequality. And I was there for 5 years. And the thing I'm probably most proud of was the fact that we did take, as some charities are really beginning to do now, we did change our approach and the general approach away from people as case studies to be used when the press and media called up and then to be dropped, to developing them, to ensuring that they had agency and their authenticity came through. And so there's a much bigger movement in the charity sector now about focusing on lived experience. And the reason I'm talking about this is because this is a way that stories influence change. They influence policy, they influence politicians. And we can be very cynical about this. I mean, I've sat in loads of sessions where politicians have listened to people's stories about being on universal credit or a whole range of things and then not done anything. But then we have to ask ourselves that we can ask ourselves a question. At least they know. If they choose not to do anything, but they know what's happening, then that's a different moral issue. So my proudest moment was sitting at the United Nations in Geneva, telling the stories of the young people that the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty had met for 2 hours during his visit to the UK. And the impact on those young people was just phenomenal. You know, they were kids who were from the West End of London, who were sofa surfing, who were sometimes homeless, who'd got in with gangs, a whole range of people. But they came out of that 2 hours saying, somebody listened to us. They weren't having to prove, to the benefits or whatever, that they had a right to something or that they were, even human in some ways for some of the systems they'd been through. But they felt listened to. And they weren't just listened to, they were listened to by the UN Special Rapporteur. And that was a huge change. They then went on to start campaigns, they saved their youth club, and that was how the change happened from their stories. So, in a sense, yes, we can do this, but we need to ensure that those two crucial things of agency and authenticity are still within that. And I'm sorry to say the charity sector hasn't all got to that stage yet, but there's a much bigger movement now than there ever was.
Again, some stuff we'll pick up on there. Just briefly, from my point of view, so I'm a writer and broadcaster. I've written for The Guardian and The Independent for a long time. More recently, The Telegraph and The Mail on Sunday, which I'm happy to talk about if anybody wants to later. And I also write and present documentaries for Radio 4, including a couple of shows called The Walk, which was about walking through landscapes and trying to pick up on the authentic experience of people who were there. It's one that we did exploring the inequalities on a walk from Harrods to Grenfell. Mm-hmm. And there's another one walking along the coast between Dover and Calais and thinking about the relationships there. I come from a working class background. My dad was a post office labourer in the beginning, and I got into writing because of a teacher, which I think is probably quite familiar to a lot of people here. East End School in the early 80s, not a nice place to be, pretty terrifying if you had any ideas or felt any emotions. And there was this particular teacher who, I'm going to be honest, I fancied, that's how it works sometimes, who said, she saw a poem or something that we'd written in class. She said, oh, you could do that. And started to tell me about stories, started to suggest books and music and stuff like that. And really said to a couple of us, there is a world outside the one that you're living in. And she never actually said that directly, but was just kind of somebody who came alongside and said, just by dropping some ideas on you, there might be another way to live. And I went to the careers guidance person when I was 15, and he said, what do you want to do? And my instinctive answer was I wanted to be David Bowie, but you couldn't really say that, also because my given name was Colin, and you can't be David Bowie if you're called Colin, which I changed fairly soon afterwards. But I said I want to be a writer. And he said, so does everybody else, what do you really want to do? You should go and work in a bank. And because of that, and because the editor of the local paper came, and because nobody else was interested, 4 months later I went on work experience at the paper, and then 6 months later I joined the paper as an apprentice and gave 2 fingers to the careers advisor. And we were talking earlier about accent and access. You were talking about that, Melissa. At the age of 15, I remember my dad coming home from work and raging about the fact that somebody at work had been passed over for promotion because they were deemed to be too posh. Not too posh, that's a Freudian slip. Deemed to be too common. And they were EastEnders, and this was in the days before the East End and the estuary accent became fashionable, and people like Tony Blair used it to pretend to be authentic. And you were seen to be thick. And I remember thinking at the time, no one's going to catch me out like that. I'm going to change my voice. And so I did. And then when I went to work in broadsheet papers, I pretended to be posher than I was. And when Natasha asked us about coming here, I thought, what am I doing there? I thought, what I'm doing actually is I'm trying to represent people who have felt like we needed to lie about who we were and pretend to be something else in order to get access to this golden world. And because I don't want that to happen to anybody anymore. And there came a point when I was asked to do a radio program, and they said, you can't do it because you're too posh. I was bloody furious, as you can imagine. And then I won an award, and they let me make another radio program, and I made one about accent, because I realized that right now, although Estuary and East End are very fashionable, the multicultural London English is like the plague accent. You can't get employed if you speak like that, and that is a disgrace. So we need to do something about that. Anyway, so that's where I'm coming from. I suppose, the pressing question here is there any point to this? Can we actually make change? Now, Vanda, you began, that's a very touching story about the UN there. It's an open question, don't have to take it in turns, but where have people seen in their lives and in their work where stories and representation have made a difference? Oh dear.
Go on.
Well, I know it's a difficult question, but for me, it's just an obvious thing. Stories have changed my life. As we all said, we all have this experience where people told you cannot do this. I was told all my life, I was very good at school, but I was told, you cannot do this, you cannot be a writer. I wanted to be Marguerite Duras. I don't know if you've ever read her. She's less sexy than Bowie, but almost more in some ways. She's wonderful, anyway.
Yeah.
I was taken, but I couldn't say that to a teacher or a serious person, so how did I go on? Because I read people who were incredibly inspirational, and for me, writing was linked to being an outsider and wanting to change the world. I didn't read. I read Agatha Christie when I was 12, of course, because you get through them. But I stick to reading because they were the people who were discussing another world, and they were challenging the society we were living in. And I always found it unbearable to live. I was always like a very strong anti-capitalist. I was always aware of how our level of production and the way we consume, drive, travel was damaging the planet very early on, and that, the vast majority of the world is called minority everywhere in the important countries, and that's unfair and that's crazy because that drives people mad. It includes trauma and it's denied on a daily basis all the time. So it was like, how can you address that? Most of my friends said, become a politician, and it's just a very tricky route. As you said, mentioning Tony Blair, if you're working class, if you're a person of color, if you're even a woman in France, because we never even had a lot of women in the strong roles, you're just going to be used and then parked somewhere. So writing and music and film for me were the only way to change the world. And actually, when I wrote to Massive Attack, that's what I said. They said, "Oh, music can't change the world," and I'm like, well, you better not tell me that, because I'm just asking you to tell me your story, because I believe it does, and I believe you have changed the world in your way. But especially writing for music, lyrics, which for me is like modern poetry, but again, in the way we were educated at university, it was never addressed this way. There's the classical elite culture, and then there's the popular culture, no matter how great and high level and challenging it can be. It was about writing it to make it exist. So it's almost like a performative act. If you can write it, then it will come to life. Since I was an idealistic teenager, and now, of course, the world has become much grimmer. It's harder to tell my students how you're going to change the world with your next dissertation or your PhD. There's a lot of cynicism about it, but I still haven't found any other way. You can become a trillionaire and launch a spaceship to Mars, but is it going to change the world in the way that we really want to see it change? I don't know.
I think for me, and this is something after 25 years of working with people, I tell my students this, that if you're in social work, you're in nursing to change people's lives, you're in the wrong profession. All you can really do is chip it away at it, add to it, and certainly for me, it's just raising or changing the perspective of, particularly in academia, for example, that you'll find most of the literature that talks about working class young people always has a deficit, that there's something wrong with them and they need to be changed, or we need to input something into their lives. And that I never ever found that. So For me, it's given me a chance to talk about their lives in a particular way. And we also do it to ourselves, and I do this on Twitter about, almost this heroic script that working class people create for ourselves as if we're marginal. But actually, I grew up in this wonderful, rich, tenements where there was hundreds of kids flying around. My mum loved it. My mum talks fondly about, the tenements. I just remember like a sea of smoke of Golden Virginia, and just the singing, the carrying on, the humour that would cut you apart. Just you try to replicate, and you can see kids just trying to soak it all in. I mean, that is brilliant. And I think what we need to do is raise those stories, because if we don't raise those stories, then that vacuum or that void is filled by, not necessarily middle class, but just it's filled in a different way where judgments start to be made rather than promoting in a way that sort of is real. So, I mean, give an example. I was lucky enough to be part of a study that was looking at the impact of the Olympics on working class communities. And there was none, basically. It was so well organised that when the kids were looking forward to meeting people from France and Poland and all these wonderful exotic places, that they were ushered away from all the working class communities, even though the stadiums were in the working class communities. So I still went in and I talked about that. And the biggest thing that came out of it was volunteering, the amount of volunteering that working class kids do, but it's not recognised. And there was no articles at all on working class volunteering, because it's assumed it's a middle class part-time. It's what middle class people do to get ahead or whatever else. So the article that we wrote was the first one, and certainly in sports, and that talks about volunteering. Even though the pathways are different, they do it differently. They don't do it because it's going to get them ahead. They do it because somebody said, why don't you do this? Why don't you do some volunteering on a Friday night, a Saturday night, or whatever else? So that working class hero things about role models is very important as well to come through. But if we don't fill the void, that void will be filled by other people who will take advantage of and make judgments about working class culture, which is not necessarily true. And academia is full of that. And also people who will make a profit out of it. So make a profit out of deficit and say, well, we need to go in and change these lives, and therefore I'm an advisor for that. And that's not the case at all.
I was struck by you saying that about there has been traditionally a kind of class of operation, which is that they're looking for stories to exploit. They're looking for stories to sell. I remember, I know there was a session here on misery porn last night. Is our only strategy to sell the catastrophe of our upbringing? Well, if you had a good fun one, I did. It sounds like you did. What do you do with that? Nobody wants to know about that stuff. But I remember when Angela's Ashes came out, and that was, that's like a kind of classic of the genre, isn't it? I did a book about Ireland and emigration from Ireland, and the people who were selling it, who bought it for a major publisher, which is on that picture there, but then who sold it as a book. Angela's Ashes had been around, and actually I'm talking out of my backside. It was the second book, which was about London during the Blitz, right? And they said, okay, you've seen Angela's Ashes. This is Angela's Ashes with bombs, right? Because it was during the Blitz, and because it was like a misery memoir. And it wasn't that at all. It was about actually a beautiful thing that happened there. So there, in academia, that one thing is happening, and then in publishing, another thing is happening where traditionally you've had to effectively prostitute your childhood in order to get anywhere. Vanda, sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to say something there.
No, I think it's part of a bigger social issue, which is how we talk about social mobility. Because we talk about social mobility, and there's a social mobility commission and there are social mobility strategies in terms of plucking bright but poor kids out so that they can become middle class and they can have the violin lessons and the books and the skiing trips and whatever, because actually that's what children should have, mainly perpetuated by a bunch of middle class and upper middle class politicians who think this is the way to go. The whole academisation programme, all of these things, all of the things that Michael Gove did. I'm not against Michael Gove saying that 5-year-olds should know about apostrophes, but that's just me being a pedant. But, that whole thing is demonstrates that gap between those who are making the decisions and running the systems and working class people. So what they think is good is a kind of 50s style educational system, which they keep trying to drag us back to, because that's what apparently worked, and we can dispute that for them. So there is this whole narrative of plucking these people out. And the reason that I'm so passionate about that is because I grew up in, you know, if anyone watches or watched Coronation Street, those back-to-back terraced houses that all have the sort of alleyway between, with an outside toilet in the 70s in Chester, where there were probably about 5 or 6 black people in the whole city of 70,000 people then. And I was very lucky, and I got a scholarship to the independent girls' school. Now, when I got that scholarship in the 80s, I was one of 2 kids out of 60 who were able to, you know, get plucked out of that. When my mum got a scholarship to the same school 20 years previously, a quarter of the places there were for poor kids or kids whose families couldn't afford the fees. So that shows you in 20 years how different the roots, and again, you know, it's the roots out of poverty. It's the way we even talk about this is really damaging. It's a deficit model. So that's how those chances got squeezed. And so it's made it even more desperate for governments to say, we're providing roots out of poverty. Now, we all know work doesn't get us out of poverty, because, you know, we're back to precarious 0 hours contracts and low wages. But education doesn't necessarily do that now either. So, you know, it's a much bigger problem. And why are we saying, you know, by absolute definition, we're saying that working class culture isn't worthwhile? And so this is the, you know, the big national debate and the policy debate that has to be stripped down before we can actually get to work on saying, you know what, our culture is valuable, where we come from is valuable. You know, recollections of Golden Virginia and Old Spice in the bathroom are, you know, are part of the literary canon. It's not just about Brideshead Revisited.
And just to pick up on your work there, because I know you were with the Equality Trust, and now you're chief executive of the Society of Genealogists, right? Which, of course, is all about working out whether we're related to George III, isn't it? Like good old Danny Dyer. Is that not the case?
Do you know, I've now got horrible histories, the Four Georges story going through my head, the Four Georges song going through my head, which is not going to be easy to get out of. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because most people think, you know, genealogy is about tracing your history back to, you know, whoever. And I'm obsessed with John of Gaunt and Eleanor of Aquitaine. So quite frankly, if I can trace my lineage back there, I'll be really excited. But genealogy and most of the people I've met who are looking at family history, it's it's ag labs, it's agricultural labourers, it's textile workers, it's servants in houses. And this is almost the kind of purest form of social history, because it really is about working class history. You know, yeah, you might go further back and get to a king or queen, but, you know, quite frankly, that's boring. What you want to know is about where your ancestors were, what was working in a mill in Manchester like in, you know, 1820, what was happening. Why did they lose 2 children or 3 children? Or what was happening at that time? What were their lives actually like? And for me, you know, that's far more interesting than endless kind of kings and queens. And seeing social history take much more of a hold on history departments over the last 20, 30 years has been absolutely fantastic, because, you know, that is the history that is really interesting to most of us, and we can identify with it.
And in the context of what we're talking about here, there's also that process going on where people are becoming more interested in it, and it means that we are therefore saying this is valid culture. That working class culture from 50 years, 100 years ago was, and therefore, by extension, you would hope, someone would make the leap to say so is the working class culture of now.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually what it does is, you know, if we trace our families back 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 generations, and they were agricultural labourers, and we're working in a call centre, you know, that gives us, which is probably the modern day equivalent, that gives us a broader historical context of, you know what, we haven't come very far.
Even that,
debatable.
Even that,
should we
even
come
that
at
phrase,
all?
even that phrase is
Far at
problematic, isn't it?
Exactly.
What is it to come far? Yeah, you guys chip in if you've got any thoughts.
Well, it's being Scottish, you kind of, because the name Johnston. So I'm very intrigued, because I was the only kid, certainly in my scheme, that went to university. You know, it's changed now for the better, I'm assuming. But Dundee University could have been the other side of the moon. I mean, I didn't actually physically walk into Dundee University till I was 38. You know, and it was only, a few miles away. I mean, it's just incredible. But being Scottish, the name Johnston, you can identify to a certain place. And it's interesting what you're saying. all my family have just stayed there. I mean, this is hundreds of years back. This isn't just something that's, you know, and I'm the first one to probably go to America or whatever else. And it's just so interesting. That's interesting. So again, there's still a level of choice in there as well, because people want to stay. We don't all want to escape and whatever else. And all my friends are quite happy living there. And, you know, I'm very interested in going to the village they grew up, you know. But again, it is just so interesting that, yes, some people want to escape, but most don't. Most are quite happy to live that rich life that is looked down upon all the time if they have to escape from it. And if we kind of fall into that narrative, we then create only certain identities that working class writers can have.
Yeah.
And we sort of need to break out of that a little bit.
I want to slightly push back a bit about that, though, Craig, because there's also that thing of, you know, which I know people in this position, and I've met people this weekend who are in this position who are, you know, just literally trying to get by, do a couple of jobs, get some money together, scratch some money together, writing at, you know, midnight after they've done all that, just to try and get their stuff down on the page. That there's nothing romantic about that. There's nothing that, you know, you'd want to stay with that. I can understand why there's a completely fierce drive to get out of that, and a complete frustration that doors seem to slam in your face every time you think about it, and there's an invisible code. So what do we do about that? Because that's almost the flip side of that, isn't it?
Yeah, so for us, and again, going back to what we've done, certainly for academics, is really just to open a space where you can demystify or decode some of the rules that are hidden. Even though we don't know it, we invite different people to come in and talk about that. For people who are trying to break into a world that is closed, and it's a mysterious world, and it still is. And it's amazing, because I thought it was just me, and I thought it was me being ignorant, and I'm blamed for it if I don't get ahead in academia. But I don't know the rules, and against allowing spaces where we can support each other to do that. And also raise voices, raise these stories, and say that there are people who are, I mean, what's happening with universal credit is just incredible. It's just incredible stuff. But these stories need to be perpetuated. It isn't all about just getting a job and working harder and whatever else. I mean, the first time I saw how much my parents made was when I had to prove to get the grant. And I had to, you know, and I was shocked. But I never felt poor. We were poor. I had free school meals, but my mum always made sure I had the lovely packed lunch, partly because she was a cleaner at the school. I used to trade my caramel tonics with all sorts of things. But again, it's providing spaces, and this is the thing about class. So when I started looking on Twitter, and I'm a big sort of champion of working class, even though it's a risk for me as an academic to put myself out there, or as my colleague says in ACA, to come out as working class. But actually saying class is a risk, because again, you can't be working class and academic. That's crazy. Well, that's just, you know, as if 25 years of my existence just gets wiped out when I get a job. But again, opening up that space where you identify as working class. Do you have a working class heritage? Let's talk about that. What's the disadvantages of these different spaces? So in academia, certainly, but you do it with young people as well. Young people, and I've worked with kids for many years and excluded in schools. And what they do is they take away critical subjects. They say, why are you in these positions? You know, let's focus on English and maths and IT, but actually kids want to talk about and are very interested in why they're there and what's happening in their lives, and opening up those spaces. But we take it away from them, and hopefully through some of the stuff we're doing on Twitter or in face-to-face, will allow to demystify that world and then get angry about it. They were talking on angry in the last session. There's nothing better than anger as long as you use it in a positive way. But yeah, it's supporting, it's using the word class, because it's a unifying concept as well. It's for everybody. Because as soon as we mention working class, then we have to look up and say, well, what do they have above us, you know, that we don't have? So yeah, it's important to use the word class, I think. But you will get flack. I have taken flack for it. There is no thing as a working class. How can you be an academic and be working class? That's just. But you would never say that about my Scottishness. No. You would never say, well, you're not Scottish because I've lived in England for 20 years. But yet you can't be working class.
And I think, I don't know, I'm guessing that's one of the reasons why this brilliant festival has taken so long in the evolution of the world to arrive, and amazing that it has. is because there's almost that thing that once you get a post in academia, once you get published, once whatever, you're not working class anymore. So you've got to disassociate from that now and move on. Melissa.
Well, I do find that then it becomes even harder because you don't get any support from anybody anymore, and you've done it, and most of the time you will have this story where you worked so much harder than anyone else, and you were so motivated early on to finish your PhD, or you had like jobs at the same time, and obviously it's a very rarely spoken about, but academia doesn't pay really well for the amount of work you need to invest, etc., etc. But then you've got one book out, or you've reached that goal, and it's like, well, what more do you want? Working class, you've managed to be here. There's this sort of undertone that you shouldn't be here. And then after that, I find that the walls becomes much thicker. I don't know, maybe it's just me. But I do find that then you're not really included. You have to create your own network. And there's a lot of issues you cannot address anymore because you might just lose your publisher. There's lots of things that are taboo. Now you have to play by the rules. It becomes even more complicated. And of course, there's the biggest taboo of all is like if you work in culture, if you're an educator or a writer, there's a lot of what you do that's paid really, really little. So obviously the people who don't get money by working, and we all pay less and less per hour when we're working class with the modern world, 0-hour contract. A lot of people our lecturers are like, they can get read off in the middle of the year because term one's finished, something just been moved, and then they hadn't planned to be out of work in March, but they are. So it can become really difficult, and I've never earned any money through writing. I mean, I spent so many hours and I've been a journalist for years, so most of the time it's like, yeah, you get a free book when you're a reviewer. Okay, that's probably £16 saved. Oh, great. And then so it becomes a real struggle because you have to stay there, and also all your background. I find my sort of like support network not very supportive. I think a lot. My parents, my dad wanted me to be a lawyer. My mom wanted me to be an engineer. My sister's a doctor in the sense that she works in a hospital. That's what it means for most people. You're a doctor. You save lives. They said on a plane. She can do that. So there's always this sort of like, why do you work so hard? It's so useless. You don't even make money. You don't own a house. You're never going to own a house. I can't even afford to have a family, to be fair. I just work this crazy amount of hours a week, and all the things that I had to make some choices. Do you want to go on or not? And then, then it's like, how can you stay there? Sometimes I feel like it's the real struggle. As long as it was the dream, and the first book was like, you said, I could say the same words. It was like having getting married for some women is like, I think, what they get excited about. But then it's just so much hard work, and it's all the money stays with publishers, or all the production around culture is just keeping the money from the people with the ideas and the hard work. So it just becomes like, I've made all the way to get there, and then it's almost impossible to stay there. So I'm pretty sure a lot of working class writers have just, never published their 2 books, or just published a lot of short stories and never made any money from it. And after a while, you grow older, you're tired, or you decide to have a family. I mean, yesterday there was a fantastic session with a woman who's had children and had lots of rejection, but she's still writing at night and all that. But it's not easy. And even the greatest writers in history that comes from a working class background, they had a moment where, people who have been read by millions, where they were only writing. It's really hard to write when you have to work 45 hours. Even if what you do involves writing, which I'm grateful for, it's just always this unfinished things and rejection all the time. All, including my own publishers, have told me, no, your next idea is it's just, why can't you pick something that people actually are interested in, that could sell well, that's not controversial, but yet no one's a writer to be told what to write. I mean, maybe a few, but certainly not everybody. And especially when you feel like as you said, you're telling stories that have been, silenced for so many generations. So you don't want to be told to write a love story instead, do you? Would you? Would you sign up for that? Maybe because you are not a woman, they won't ask you to write a
Yeah.
love story. My publisher did tell me that. Why don't you write a nice love story that people are not going to be like upset by all these ideas and your politics? Well, I'm not really talented at writing love story. I'm so sorry.
You're right. You're right with the and certainly in academia. So, and it's Carl Benz that talks about this, certainly in her book. So when you come in academic, I don't know if he is an academic or academic world, but it's a different game. It's a different ball game altogether. It's going to conferences. It's networking. It's making up with a small chat. I was never raised around small chat. I was never raised about making pleasant conversation. It just makes me feel uncomfortable. I want a genuine conversation. I want to, get to know you in a different way and make genuine friendship with that authentic. I don't see it as authentic. So when I became a doctor, it was all of my PhD. So I'd done it part-time when I was working full-time. And I kind of only saw people come when I was coming in at 6 o'clock. And so it was great when we all graduated and stuff, and they would put on Facebook, well done, doctor. I deleted them all because I didn't want anyone to be thinking I was, a bit of a tube, at home. And it took me 10 years just to feel comfortable enough to use it and allow my wife to put on Facebook, Craig at a conference. Like I would never put this on Facebook because then I'm introduced the world of class, and then I'm introducing my community into it, and a lot of them wouldn't identify as working class. My dad doesn't identify as working class, but he's the most achingly working class man in the world. But so it's difficult. You're caught between worlds. You don't know how the game works here, but you can't. It's quite difficult as well.
I'm going to go to questions in just a second, so do get ready with your questions. I wanted just to quickly run down the panel while people are thinking about their questions with a kind of 1 or 2 sentence answer to that question that's behind us on the board. Can words truly inspire a better world? And picking up on what you just said, Craig, there, I just wanted to say my answer to that would just be an example of there's a couple of lads. One of the lads is from Renfrewshire, and I had the privilege of writing a non-fiction book about a heart transplant that went on between this lad who got the heart of he was 16 and he got the heart of a 16-year-old lad from Grantham, and his life was saved by that. And so I had the privilege of writing their story for them. And then that was published, and there was some change around donation that happened. There was a conversation that happened there, and they, as a family, felt, they told me that they felt that they were then able to go out and talk about it. So Linda, the mum, who would not ordinarily expect herself to be on the Lorraine sofa in the morning, was there. So their life was made a bit better, and also their cause was shared, and the memory of 2 boys was honoured. So that would be my answer to that. Yeah, I think sometimes it can inspire a better world. So what would you say?
Well, in my former life at the Equality Trust, it's a perfect example because the Equality Trust was set up by 2 academics, Professors Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, who wrote a book that some of you might be familiar with called The Spirit Level. And it was an international bestseller explaining that, in countries with high levels of income inequality, we also have higher levels of all of those socially determined ills. So higher levels of drug addiction, alcohol addiction, violence, teenage pregnancies, poor mental health, poor physical health, all of these things. And in the 10 years, 12 years since it's been published, it's had an absolutely phenomenal impact because people have realised, the IMF, the OECD, the Pope, Obama, and the CBI, not exactly flag standard bearers for socialism, but it has been recognised that income inequality is probably the greatest problem after climate change. So just using that as an example, I would say yes, words can inspire, but I want to actually really take that back to us as individuals. And I think when we read books, it becomes a part of us. Everything we've read is in our consciousness, everything. And so that has played a part in shaping us and really framing who we are. So we may not feel the direct consequence of this book made me go out and do that, but I think it has shaped who we are and the things that we do and the things and the values that we care about.
I mean, for me, again, I grew up with music, rather Elvis all the time, just flying around every Elvis song I know from my dad. And there wasn't a lot of books in my house. Mills and Boon, I think my mum got a couple of them. But words belong to us as much as they do any other class. I went to a library, Glasgow Mitchell Library, I think it was, when I was at university, because I couldn't study in my flat because all my middle class and upper class flatmates were carrying on, drinking games, and I wanted to finish my degree because I didn't want to upset my mum because she was working so hard. And I suddenly realised this is the place I want to be. If you told a 15-year-old Craig that I would willingly go to a library on a Saturday, sit there, enjoy it, and lap it up with a biscuit, these words are there, words are for us, and particularly our words, particularly our accent, our dialect. Like this is called the jotter, where I'm from. I mean, what a brilliant word that is. It's us, and it's allowing the young people to say their words as well. And you'll often find with young people, particularly with disadvantaged communities, no one ever asks them. No one ever asks them their words. About their lives, about their lifestyles, about who they are, and just opening up. And also just as well, those psychic injuries that Diane Ray talks about when we were younger, we were very conscious of what people say. And I think what we say to people, whether you're a teacher or whether you're a social worker or a nurse or whether you're an academic, is saying that you're a good writer. There's nothing more powerful than that. Because again, I was always told, you stop writing the way you speak. Told that loads of times, and I'm like, what's wrong with the way I speak? I get it, I understand the English language but again, the words we say to people, particularly to young people, are around. But it's starting to change now. Like, I'm now being asked to be on the editorial board for a class and culture journal. I mean, that's brilliant. This would never have happened. This would never have happened. Actually voicing and using words that, like jotter, I never thought I'd use the word jotter, other than in school. But that, I mean, to me, it's brilliant. And just the words that your auntie, your uncle, your mum and your dad say, just to continue that in that rich vein. Because I know that, I think it was Kit Duval was saying, I don't know if Kit's here, but she was saying it's very difficult to get published if you have, if you're writing your own dialect and whatever else. But yeah, I think it belongs to all of us. The words are ours. We created these words. And we shouldn't sort of bow down to using other words just because it's more sellable. But I understand the pressure that could be difficult as well to get published.
Melissa?
Yeah, I agree with both of you in some way. So I also had no books in my house. There was only one book hidden with the bottles of alcohol from my dad about the Algerian War that I was not allowed to look at because he wanted me to know as little as possible about it. And then I got to bring the books because I was very good at school. I was a year ahead. No one knows how or why. None of my grandmother could write in any language. Just picked up. And then when you were a good student, you were offered book as prize at school. So I just bought them, and then I asked my mum to read it again. So she thought I might enjoy the library. And then, when I was 18, I spent Saturdays at the library as well. All my friends were having fun at the bar. Because you just want to learn, you don't want to let your parents down. I had chosen a literary path, so I was already letting them down, and so I had to be excellent at it. But also, I liked reading at that time because it's beautiful. I think that's the thing. For me, it's like culture, music was an enormous part of my life, and it came through soul music and hip-hop. That, again, was not considered high culture. But it made my life better. I had this very strong sense that we all fast going into this world where you have to work, and then retire and die. So what is enjoyable along the way? To travel, to meet people, to have strong connections, and to enjoy anything that's beautiful. And obviously words are part of that. So it's almost a form of rebellion in a highly productive world to be able to just enjoy beauty, and whether it's music, lyrics, or cinema, or books, it comes through the love of language. So I kind of felt like I wanted to teach that to other students, but I've been back to my neighborhood to meet many friends who are teachers to teenagers, and they don't care. They don't want to learn. They don't want to go to university. They're very much aware that most of degrees won't change their life. They won't give them a better money, a better chance of owning a flat or getting out of the local horrible estates with 25 towers and 180 floors. So it's about how teaching to people this enjoyment about beauty and creating their own meaning for themselves. Like the ultimate goal is not always to get out of poverty or get out of where you come from. It's more like to learn to re-enjoy life. And maybe we have a chance with this sort of like complete apocalyptic, damageable, end of the world climate change sort of where we are, where we might end up this system, and we might just relearn to take time to enjoy nature, to reconnect with the community, to just collect the words of grandparents or neighbors who were never valued. So I think for me, the whole thing about words is linked to beauty, creativity, and creating the past for yourself. It's about the meaning. It's like I've been lucky to use that word a lot. I've been very, very lucky as well. But that's because I was living in my mind. There's a lot of reality of the world that I completely ignored. It's like all my teacher says you can't do this. All my friends said you can't do this degree. You can't do this job. You can't travel if you don't drive. You can't do this if you're a woman. You can't do this if you're an immigrant. You can't blah, 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 always. But because I kept dreaming about it, putting the words on it, writing a diary, no matter what it was, letters to my best friends, I believed in it. And I'm sure we can try to teach that to young people again. And it could be through something they love, but...
It just makes me think, it keeps, what all of you have said keeps driving me back to the idea of libraries as engines of change, portals to other worlds, you know, and the fact that they're closing is a disgrace in terms of equality, in terms of opening up the world. So we need to do something about that. Let's put that on the list. Let me take some questions. We have a roving mic, so do just wait for a second once you have it. Has anybody got any questions? This lady here, and then I'll come to that man there.
I haven't really. I mean, my questions would be, I'd love to have a chat about this equality thing that you're doing, but it's more just all the things you've been making me think because of my own life, where like I did a degree in art and was told in my first year, oh, do you want to know why we gave you a place? The teacher was drunk, and then I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And in the end they said, oh, it's just because of your accent. We thought you'd liven the course up. And the things I had said to me, achieving doing a degree because of my accent, and I ended up rejecting fine art, and I've been a community artist, so I've got loads of thoughts from what you're saying, because I've devoted my life to community arts and raising money to work in deprived areas. And I feel like the whole word class is taboo because they are manipulating the divides. They're manipulating, the Green Party divide them with trans and gender. Labour divide it on the anti-Semitism. They will not have the word class out, and then the Tory party conference was all, we're levelling up, and it's like, levelling up from what? You destroyed everything. You are still destroying everything. So it's more, I'm interested in where what you're saying fits into the wider context. Politically and what's going on, and how I want the word class out there.
Right.
That,
Okay, well, I'll get some responses to that in
Yeah.
a second. We'll take the other question from the gentleman. Thank you.
Yeah, mine sort of builds on what was just said, is that, the idea of like the individual response as the solution, it's like, oh, give us some crumbs, can we have a door in, please? Is like, to me, is just completely the wrong approach. And it feels to me at the moment what we've seen over the last, particularly since austerity, it's been just it's like modern day enclosures. So it's like, we're having everything taken away now. Like the libraries is a really good example. But it's not just libraries, it's like space to gather, or space for working class to organise. All of this is being slowly eradicated, and at the same time, we're being denied any access to politicians or any access to accountability. And I think the thing for me is like, if you want, when I think of how can words truly inspire a better world, I mean, it's the Communist Manifesto was something which inspired, whether that didn't work out very well, particularly in, historically, but it feels like rather than it being the individual response, it's like, how do we have a demand? It's not about like, oh, can we please come in? It's like, no, you need to do this. You need to change. This structure has to change, because otherwise, the way it's going is it's going to be horrific. The polarization in the country now is so bad, and that is driven by the narrative of the Tories and the narrative of the cultural narrative of, like, the racist white working class, these people who don't understand what's going on. It's like, I don't know how we change this, but there needs to be some sort of more common solidarity message or demand.
Okay, thank you. Let's get some responses to that, and then I'll take a couple more questions.
I mean, I think what we're talking about really is, I grew up in the 80s, and I suspect many of you will remember that, where the ideas of community were smashed by Thatcher. And what we've seen over the last years is this focus, this atomization on individuals. So, we will get a poor but bright person, and that's fine. What we're not doing is anything about the other 29 kids in that class who also deserve a very good education. So, what we need is that systemic change and the systems change that drives that. And that's huge. There was a lot of talk with the pandemic of, we're going to build back better. We're not going to do things in the way that we did. Pretty quickly, I mean, I was, one of the cynical ones saying, it's going to take a lot more than that for people to actually do that. But pretty quickly, we all went back to normal. And I mean, we all went back to the system's normal. And we know that's not working. And we know it's not working for more and more people. And what we've seen is the atomization, we've seen the change in working conditions, the decline of the power of trade unions, the decline of collective action, because we're all being told, look over there, there aren't enough hospitals, there aren't enough facilities. Oh, that's because there are too many migrants coming in. No, it's not. It's because you aren't putting money into the NHS or building hospitals, etc., or building infrastructure. So, we have to keep our eyes on the prize in a sense. And I have to say that, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a political option. I'm trying to word my words really carefully here, that allows us to do that. And so that means that we have to take other actions rather than relying on a political party that will represent working people, because quite frankly, at the moment, we don't have one. So it has to be systemic change. It can't be this, let's pick at various things. Great Marcus Rashford gets kids school meals for a few months. But, that's just sticking a plaster on an absolutely open, gaping wound. If we don't sort out the systems that are allowing this and that are profiting from this, then it's not going to change. It's just going to continue to get worse.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more questions. Yes, here.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is what you were talking about, the default sort of system. A book that inspired me recently was Walkaway by Cory Doctorow, and where the default sort of capitalist system, people, it takes place 20 years in the future, and they have technology where they can just walk away from the society, so they just let it fail. So that's
Could you say that name again?
Walkaway by Cory Doctorow. And like I said in the book, people have the technology through 3D printers and through inventions in agriculture, so they can walk away to the parts of the country that aren't uninhabited to get away from the default society. Right. But the question I had is what Melissa was describing earlier about the to read and listen to music, to rebel by enjoying beauty. How would you define that in like a single word? Because it sounds like mindfulness to me. Would you define it as that, or?
Well, I guess again, we're talking about words there, so it's probably, it'd be great to have a collective reflection on it. It could be mindfulness, absolutely, because I think for me that what it was, this access to something that was less divisive and less focused on productivity, turning us into robot, was what I call beauty, but it was a form to find meaning. It was almost a spiritual quest in some ways. And that link to the fears that we've heard just before, I think there's a reason why we have a cultural war. It's because the words that the people in power are using are working against all of us, right? They do that on purpose, and they turn our own weapons back at us in some ways. So that shows us that it works. It shows us that words have a very, very strong power, and that's why we've got the whole economy that we have, everything turned digital because, they've taken it away from independent producers of culture. Now, instead of having all our libraries and independent bookshops, we have Amazon. Instead of having, multiple cinema filmmakers, we have platforms, we have Netflix, and some of more complex, interesting, layered, reflecting society form of art still managed to get out, but it's becoming harder and harder. It's all about money, and we've been tricked into it by thinking if I have a smartphone, it's so much easier to create everything I want, so I will start by having that, and then I can make a film, but then all the money has been shifted away from, and all the channels as well, so it's about the control of culture. So of course I agree with you. I'm not saying the solution is individual on the action level, it's more individual on the reception and feeling and emotional and intellectual level, because if we all give up, if all the people who've got a bit more strength, who are still writing, still producing culture, still bringing discourse out there, get completely used, depressed, pushed aside, not published, not heard, then they can't have the domino effects on people that are more fragile, and then it's all collapse. And we are very close to crazy system that many have written about years and years ago, right? From 1984 to previous than that. I worked on a film about Karl Marx and his use and how he came to Britain, and we were hoping to have like a bestseller movie, but the only place where we sold millions of tickets was China, because there they used the film as a propaganda tool. They watched it to make sure it was all right, but I invited the filmmaker to speak here in Bristol, the Woodshed, but it's been shown like 1 week in one cinema in Bristol and a couple of cinemas in London. That's social control through culture. And so if this appropriation of our words, of our creativity, works so strongly on one way, the ones who have all the power, it can also work the other way. That's all what I'm trying to inspire people, because, as you say, if we wait to change the system, we can wait forever. If we wait for a party in a two-party system that's going to do it for us, we're going to wait. We're going to look at the trains passing, as we say in French. So, yeah, you can only rely on you, a couple of friends. I mean, most of my friends are quite middle class, so they're really not worried, really they don't care. They haven't read my book. They haven't come to my talks, apart from my best friend. She's Scottish, so I think that's why. They have this rebellious thing. That's why I've moved to Bristol, because I find there's a lot of places where people are just, the middle class is so comfortable that, people complain that if we block Princess Victoria Street, they can't go to their shop. Like, it's Clifton, it's small. And are you really it's going to be the end of your life because you can drive there? That's the level of change that people don't want. So you kind of have to be extremely radical. So apart from a couple of crazy artists, I don't know who's radical enough,
Just in the nature of what we're talking about, going back to what you were saying there, I mean, I see in young people now, and this is a change where I grew up. So politics was, again, it's the other side of the moon. Nobody talked it in my home or anything like that, but kids are talking about it now. And I'm not saying Karl Marx is the way to go, but kids are interested in Karl Marx. They've forgotten about the millions of people who have died, even though it's rammed down their throat in school. Kids are really interested. Twitter, as much as it's a bizarre thing to say, but actually there's a lot of, and I'm careful with the word solidarity, but there's a lot of people out there who are interested in class. I mean, I put out a couple of tweets and you would think everyone was working class. So there's an interest in being working class, there's interest in what that means. And I've found a lot of good stuff coming out of that, and a lot of spaces to talk about it, even though it's not physical. There's a lot of it going online. The problem we've got with things like Twitter is everyone just follows people that agree with them, rather than sort of, that intercourse or intersectionality of different, ideas. But it's also about resources, about people becoming more aware that private school, Brian was talking about in the last session, private school is monopolising the education system. We know that, and that goes back to sharing and saving beauty. Like if you come from a working class background, like all my educational standards have been knocked down, so all my schools are gone because they're all temporary.
I think we all
You know.
benefited from free education. I would not have been doing this degree if I had to borrow money
Forget about
for
it.
10 years.
No,
Would never have happened.
no chance. And so again, there's a lot of good things there. There's a lot of things changing. Kids in council estates are becoming political, understanding. But Paul, I'm having conversations with kids about Boris Johnson, about what it means. Unfortunately, they don't get the same message about other political parties the way they get it about sort of one particular party. But yeah, I think lots of good things are changing. Lots of things that may come up. We don't see it because kids' lives are lived online rather than starting a band.
I hope some of them are still starting.
Well, sorry, massive attack. I'm really interested now. You have to tell me where you're going next. But,
Oh, yeah. Melissa's just about to rush across the road to the Amalfini and interview Goldie in a minute. So I shall shoot out the
We
door.
have-
so what
Yeah,
if
I
we all
should
need to
do.
go?
Vanda,
Yeah.
final words from you.
Well, I think I've said quite a lot actually. But I think building on what you've said about young people, they want to know. And the reason that we set up this project with young people when I was at the Equality Trust was that I remember the shame and the stigma of being poor. I went to this private school. I sat next to this girl who said, "Hello, my name's Hobby, and I've got a pony called Monty." And I just thought, why? Why am I here? I'm not going to get through the next 6 or 7 years. And there were all the sorts of things that happen in secondary school. But what I remember is feeling ashamed. Feeling ashamed, not of my family, but knowing that kids felt ashamed because they didn't have, the latest football boots or whatever. They didn't have the things that other kids had. They weren't going on skiing trips or whatever was happening. And it wasn't just that sort of level. It was, they had one set of school uniform and it was on the dryer because it had got muddy, and they didn't have another set, so they didn't go to school the next day. And I just didn't want kids to feel like that. I wanted kids to know that this was not their fault and it wasn't their parents' fault, and it was the system. And I wanted them to understand it wasn't their fault that they were living in poor accommodation or they were only able to get bad jobs, or, I remember one kid saying, "Oh, I could be a personal trainer." And I was thinking, you could be anything. But society's telling you you're a young mixed-race black kid, you're a young mixed-race kid, you're going to be a personal trainer, or you're going to work in a gym or something like that, or it's too late to be a footballer. So all of these things that are being told to working-class kids, that they can't do this, they can't do that, they're not even looking at what they can do. When we have these grand programs, and this is another thing about the profitization, in a sense, of deprived areas and deprived people. I've lost count of the number of well-meaning people who've set up charities to help deprived kids. We'll get some middle-class mentors and we'll get to spend some time with them, and then they'll be fine. That is absolutely outrageous. And it's just so damaging to think that if we can make these people like us, then they'll be fine. And that is still the kind of charitable approach, and that's really damaging. So the point for me is really to make people aware of the system, of what capitalism really is. And I'm not even just talking about, capitalism built off the backs of slaves and women and other working class people. I'm talking about what it does to you now. And that way, they are equipped with the knowledge, and they will want to campaign, and they find words in their own lives that will express what they're going through and their stories. Because if they don't understand this system, they're going to blame themselves. And, we know where that leads.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you for being on the panel. Thank you for listening. I guess if the question is, can words truly inspire a better world, I think we've heard many different ways in which the answer to that is yes. And I think probably the thing we ought to do is go away and get on with it, really, in whichever way we can. So thanks so much for attending. Thank you to Natasha and all the other organisers of this brilliant festival for having us. And thank you to the panel.